A new Planet Fitness location is coming soon. To celebrate, you can join before we open for just $1 down, $10 a month, no commitment. We're squeaky clean and ready to welcome you with tons of equipment and plenty of space to spread out. Join the judgment-free zone today. We're ready when you are. Just $1 down, $10 a month, no commitment.
Backed by popular demand. Join our new club coming to Circleville for $1 down and $10 a month. Pre-sale ends September 14th.
Planet Fitness locations are independently owned and operated. See club for details.
Hey guys, it's Allie. Welcome back to Infertile AF, the podcast. This is episode 186 called Corey. This episode is supported by Receptiva DX. The Receptiva DX test can help couples struggling with unexplained infertility. Getting pregnant isn't easy, as so many of you know. Many couples struggle with infertility, and unexplained infertility can be particularly frustrating. Women facing unsuccessful IVF may not know that endometriosis is the underlying cause, a disease that can impact the success rates of IVF treatments and often has no symptoms. The Receptiva DX test can help identify endometriosis before an embryo transfer, and it has the potential to save women the stress, anxiety, and cost of multiple failed IVF attempts. The good news is, multiple studies show treatment of women with a positive Receptiva DX test improves live birth outcomes by over 50%. Receptiva DX can detect all stages of endometriosis and help women make better decisions in planning for pregnancy. You can learn more at receptivadx.com or download their app, which is also called Receptiva DX. Today's episode is presented by Belly. Belly offers modern prenatal vitamins optimized for fertility, prenatal, and post-pregnancy health. To learn more about how to optimize your fertility and pregnancy health, check out their vegan-friendly, dairy-free, non-GMO vitamins for both men and women at bellybaby.com. That's spelled BELIBABY.com. The best part, if you use code ALLIE15, you'll get 15% off your first month of either Belly Women or Belly Men. Again, that's code ALLIE15, ALI15, for 15% off. Thanks, Belly. Okay, guys, I love this guest I have on today. I had such an amazing time talking to Corey Silverberg, who's a sex educator and author of many books, but the latest book is called You Know Sex, a graphic style book that the New York Times recently called one of the books about sex that every family should read. And I could not agree more. The New York Times book review said, Silverberg's writing is fearless. Here's that rare voice that can talk about the hardest things kids go through in ways that are thoughtful, lighthearted, and always respectful of their intelligence. And that's one of the reasons I love talking to Corey. So we're going to get into all of it. The fact that, You Know Sex is the first thoroughly modern sex education book for everybody. And it not only covers the big three of puberty, hormones, reproduction, and development, it also talks about power, pleasure, and how to be a decent human being. It obviously also talks about fertility and miscarriage and all the things. So it's a breakthrough. It's a revelation. I loved it. And without further ado, this is Corey's infertility story. All right. So, hey, Corey, it's so good to talk to you today. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to meet you.
Yes. So you are the author of this new book that came out, many books, but this is your fourth book called You Know Sex. It's like a graphic style novel. I don't know if you like that term, but that's how I would describe it at least. It came out in April. The New York Times recently called it one of the books about sex that every family should read. And I emphatically agree. I've been flipping through it. You know, I have a daughter who's almost 13. I have a son who's 6.5. So this book, I want to sit down with her and like go through some of the chapters. And one of the reviews for your book says, Silverberg's writing is fearless. Here's that rare voice that can talk about the hardest things kids go through in ways that are thoughtful, lighthearted, and always respectful of their intelligence. So thank you for writing this book, first of all.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. So tell me, this is kind of a trilogy, right? We were talking a little bit before we started recording. Tell me about the other books that you've written so far, and then we'll talk about this one.
Sure. Well, so it started actually with this book called What Makes a Baby that was really written because no book like it existed. So it has a very particular origin, but it ends up being very broad, which is that it was I was around the time I had a lot of friends that were starting to make babies, and a lot of my friends were trans, and so in Toronto where I was living at the time, there's a big community of trans parents. So these are families that are usually using an egg donor or a sperm donor, or sometimes both. Not doing it the old-fashioned way, I would say. And one of my closest friends had a 4-year-old son, and him and his partner were about to have another baby. And their son finally started asking questions. And the fact is that no books worked for them, right? Because every book at the time that was out there says you have a mom and a dad, who, by the way, you both live with, who love each other.
Right. And everything's perfect.
Exactly. No, really. Like, it's just, it's kind of nuts when you think about it. When you're born using your dad's sperm and your mom's egg, and it went, and there's no indication that it ever was a problem. It just happened. And that's the end of the story. And of course, that's not true for so many of us. But I actually happened to be focused on this particular piece, which was trans families and queer families. As it turns out, once I wrote it, quite quickly I realized, of course, I have lots of heterosexual families in my life that were using fertility support of some kind. And there's single parent families, and there's families that adopted. And it's this sex education piece. What I really was aware of was, there's lots of books about how we make relationships for kids. But the sex education piece about, well, how are babies made, was only telling this one story. And it's annoying to me that parents have to, when they want to tell their kid this very important story, that they also have to say, but we're different, right? Like, so here's this, but we don't, and do this piece of, like, which makes us all feel a little bit weird, sometimes bad. And I don't think we should have to do that. I think we should be able to tell our kids the stories of their lives in a way that centers their experience. And it, of course, can say there's lots of ways to do it.
Sure.
So it started there, and then the story is that it was a Kickstarter, actually. So I just, publishers weren't interested at the time, so I did it. It went viral. We became the most funded picture book they had ever had at the time, and then publishers started coming to us. So I signed a 3-book deal, and so myself and Fiona Smith made 3 books. So you have the newest one.
I have it right here.
Puberty age kids. So there's a lot more. The first one is like 32 pages. It looks just like a plain picture book. The book you have, I think, is a graphic novel is a good way to describe it. And it goes through everything, including getting into kind of the details of fertility and reproduction that, if you tried to do it with a 4-year-old, they would just be bored. So we didn't do it with the first one.
Yeah. One of the descriptions that I want to read, I think it was from your website, which is just, I couldn't say it better myself. So I'm just going to read what you already wrote, which is, it says it's the first thoroughly modern sex education book for everybody, covering not only the big 3 of puberty, hormones, reproduction, and development, but also power, pleasure, and how to be a decent human being. And that makes me want to cry, Corey, because I'm like, that's so fucking awesome that you include all that as well. Because as we were saying before we started recording, one of the very, very common themes that I find when I'm interviewing people for this podcast and in Fertility Rally, which is my membership community, people just have had very bad sex education, including myself. We were taught, this is what I was taught growing up. If you have sex without a condom, you will get pregnant. So don't have sex without a condom. The end, period, blah, 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 blah. So when I found myself, going through the secondary infertility journey, I had my daughter, no problems, thank God. And then I had 4 losses, and I ended up using IVF to have my son because I was older. I didn't know anything about my fertility. I was like, what? After 35, like, things happen to your eggs. And, there was just so many pieces of it that I didn't know. And I was like, I felt so gypped that, like, I hadn't learned that. So that's why I wanted to have you on today, because I think this is such a breakthrough, and the stuff that you're talking about is so important. So everybody get this book, get all the books. But,
oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm uncomfortable with praise. So I'm always like,
me too. But I'm not being emphatic. I'm like, this is legit.
No, I do appreciate it. But so I'm 52. And so this is absolutely my experience of having so many women in my life who were ripped off, right? Yeah. Who were ripped off by their sex education and by their general education, because they were told not only it's so easy to get pregnant, that all you need to focus on is not getting pregnant.
Yes,
but
exactly.
They were also told in all sorts of other ways through TV and film that the thing that makes them a woman is is like giving birth.
Yes.
Right? To be a woman, that the only thing that a real mom gives birth and a real woman gives birth.
Yes.
And so it was so clear to me, supporting friends through this, that so much of the pain, I mean, particularly miscarriages, any kind of loss is hard, and it will always be hard. But there was this added pain of feeling like you were a failed woman, a failed human,
broken, not a real woman. Yeah.
Exactly. And I saw it so clearly about that early education. So in our books, we don't do any of that stuff. Right. And it's interesting because I'm genderqueer. So part of the work of doing gender differently in the books is about being more gender expansive, but it's also for all the people who are binary, like to stop saying, puberty is so for example, in this new book, we never say puberty is a time when boys become men and girls become women.
Right.
Because that's not, because going through this very difficult big time that's awful, where your hormones are raging, like everything's changing. That's not, I disagree. I don't think that's what makes you a woman or a man.
Totally.
Right? And I think the idea that, again, part of the thing we're working against is the idea that we're ever done. Right.
Yeah.
That it's like kind of like that there's this change, right? So as you're saying, right, like no one told you, wait, at 35, everything starts changing. Because sex education traditionally is always this, like, the big change is puberty. After puberty, you're fine. Your body's, after 18.
Yeah.
And of course, anyone who's survived past 18 knows that our bodies keep changing.
Right. And then they're like, you either have kids or you don't. And then it's menopause and then you're dead. Like, it's just, there's so many intricacies that are glossed over, and so many parts of development and becoming, as you say, a decent human being, which are just totally not covered. So tell me about, you were raised by a librarian and a sex therapist, correct?
Correct.
So tell me about, what did you know about sex and family building when you were growing up? Like, what were you taught? What was it talked about a lot in your home? Like, it seems like a pretty woke environment, maybe.
Except it was the 70s. I guess it was for its time in its world, right? So I grew up in this like middle-class Jewish home.
Okay.
Definitely more progressive around sex than any of my peers, friends. My father had my father had been a family doctor, so it was a bit weird. Like, so there was a little bit of like, it's okay because he was a doctor, but by the time I was a toddler, he was already practicing sex therapy. And so definitely that was a weird job in the 70s and unusual. I think so. The truth is, so the things, I had all the books, right? So I had all the sex ed books there were. So there was never any mystery about like where babies came from. I think, honestly, to be honest, and this isn't necessarily related to this topic, but the difference was that I was told that sex was not a bad thing, that in fact it was a good thing. And in fact, because my parents had grown up in the 50s, pretty emphatically told, like, do not get married right away, right? Like, you probably want to explore yourself and your body. And, they didn't say this, but the message kind of was like, it was kind of an anti kind of like save yourself for marriage,
right?
Because sex is an important part of life. I guess that was the best thing I got. It still was. I didn't get, of course, because our world was still quite narrow. So, I knew some people who were single moms, but, there was still silence around that. So it wasn't, I think where we're at today is so much better. Like, because even back then, I know now, because this is my training, the best practices often were, don't tell your kid. Right. If you were using some kind of fertility support or even and adoption, sometimes it was like, don't tell your kid because it will be harmful. And now, of course, thankfully, the best practices are no, you tell early, you tell often, you make it part of the story, because it isn't
right. It just becomes the fabric of their life. Right.
Right.
Wait, Corey, I have to ask you, did you have the book, Where Did I Come From?
Of course. Yeah.
Oh my God.
I still have it behind
me.
Me
had that too. My sister and I remember looking through that as like a little kid. Probably like 4 or 5. And like, there was pictures of boobs and like bush and, and it was bodies that weren't perfect. And I remember we would like pore over that book, and we thought it was so crazy that was in like an illustrated book.
And it was also fun. I think the other thing I loved about it is because it's so funny, because I also remember the boobs.
Can't you picture the illustrations so vividly? Like the sperm with like the faces on them.
And the tuxedo.
Yes, totally.
Yes.
Yes. It's I actually bought it for my daughter when she was like 4, and she was like, this is so weird. And I was like, yeah, I guess it is kind of weird. But.
Well, the other thing, I don't know if you read it with her fully, but the other really weird thing that I remember very clearly, that I'm still not sure how I feel about it, is the description of an orgasm. Because it was one of the things that was so cutting edge about it, was that it used the term orgasm, and it said it's like a sneeze. Like that's how they try to describe it to kids. And I think that's a bit, I mean, it's not bad. It's not harmful, but it's a bit weird because kids sneeze because we all sneeze.
Oh
and
my God.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think what they were saying was that it's involuntary.
Yes.
Right? That an orgasm is something that you don't, it happens. I mean, I guess you can, you can do things to make it happen, but you can't force it.
I just had like a, sorry to interrupt. I just had like a total connection in my brain that I've never had before, which was that when I was like little, like probably in like grammar school, like maybe fourth, fifth grade, I used to like roll up a Kleenex and make myself sneeze. I don't know if you ever did that, but it was like, maybe that's the connection there. Like I was trying to give myself
you were exploring early sexual exploration.
Did you ever do that? Or am I totally weird?
I didn't, but I know people who did. So you're not totally weird. I think I have a nose thing. So.
Yes. And then like, of course, masturbation, all that stuff. And I think
funny.
Yeah, it is funny. Sorry, I just had that. Like, I was like, oh, maybe that's why I did that. Because where did I come from? Told me it felt like a sneeze.
Yeah, which was a good thing.
Yes. So, okay. So did you have a lot of LGBTQ like plus people in your life growing up or like?
Well, I mean, it was the 70s. So that, I mean, there were, so the answer is no, actually. So even though, I mean, I was raised to be, certainly I got the message if I was going to be gay, then that would be fine. I didn't have any trans people in my life and I'm genderqueer. So it would have been nice if I had, because my life might be different now if I had known that was an option. But it was, I mean, it was still, again, it was like, I was still raised in kind of, this sort of like insular middle class, way. So I didn't have a lot of, I mean, I had access. I knew there was another world out there. And that's what I think kind of kept me alive in a way, that I knew that even I was never really finding my friends and I never felt comfortable. But I knew there were other people out there. So that was sort of very helpful to know, like, okay, if I survive this childhood thing, I'll probably find my people.
Okay. When did you like find your people and feel comfortable being like your authentic self?
Oh, well, those are two questions. So I found my people in my 20s. I'm still not fully I mean, I don't know. I don't really know. The authentic self language doesn't fit for me because I don't know what that is really. I mean, it fits for some people. So it's not to put that language down, but I'm still kind of awkward and uncomfortable in my body a lot of the time. So.
Okay. Same.
So it's a journey.
Yeah.
Right?
And I feel like I'm still learning.
Better. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So when did you decide to become a sex educator and author and get into this whole world?
So I thought I was going to be a therapist and not a sex educator because that's what my dad did, right? So my feeling was like, oh, I'm not going to do anything related to what my parents did. But my dad actually got me a job when I was a teenager in a sex store that was owned by these two women. And it wasn't like a, cool hip sex store like there are now, but it was owned by these two women who were like decent people who weren't ashamed of sex. So even though there was still a lot of like titillation and novelty, it was an amazing place to work. And I worked there through my undergraduate university, and then I ended up opening my own store with some other people, a worker cooperative. Like that was kind of more of a queer kind of, whatever, not hip, but store. So it was, and I guess the thing is I did a master's degree. I thought I was going to be a therapist, but I have very high energy. And at the time I thought therapists were like these very calm people. Like the therapists I had were all like calm. Right. They just sit there and they just listen and they don't say very much. I was like, I can't do that. Like when I talk to people, I want to talk to them. I want to ask questions. So I realized education is more suited to me. So I became a sex educator. I got trained. And so it was like the late 90s.
Okay. So why do you think there aren't more like super transparent, relatable books like this one about sex and our bodies and fertility and all that stuff? Like, why is it? I mean, okay, before I have you answer, I would say my theory is that it's just like part of it is like a business thing, right? Like when I went to write a infertility book, which never ended up happening because I was shopping my book proposal around and everyone was like, this isn't going to sell. Nobody buys this. Like, it's just, we're not going to make any money off this. And it was so heartbreaking. I was like, really? And sad truth is like, I know the people that have come out with, publish, not self-publish, but like the ones where they work with a publisher. And they really don't sell that many. Like I've seen the statistics, they really don't sell that many copies. And it's a bummer, So I'm wondering is that part of the reason you think there's not more books like yours?
So I want to respond to that though. But first I'll answer your question. Then I want to respond to the bummer part, especially for you and anyone else listening who might want to write a book. I think it's a couple of things. I think the people who have the information. So the thing is that a lot of people, if you haven't gone through this journey, right? So there are some people, less and less, who actually go through life with relatively little friction. So if they want babies, they have them when they want them, and they stay in a relationship. I mean, again, fewer of us actually get through life that way,
right?
But because of that, but those are the ones with time and energy, right? So part of the answer is like why when I wrote the first book, and it was amazing that no one had written a book like this. Well, the answer is because the people who know that it was needed were being parents, and they didn't have time to write a book.
Okay.
Right. So who has the energy to write a book? Number one. So, but it is true that, the publishing industry just isn't very creative, right? Particularly the mainstream publishing industry. Mm-hmm. They think they know what sells based on what has sold in the past, as if new things don't actually sell, right? So as if there isn't a memoir about fertility that couldn't be a bestseller. Of course there is. We haven't seen it. And of course it does need to be marketed in a certain way, et cetera, because of capitalism. But I guess the other thing I want to say to you and to anyone else is when they say it won't sell, what they mean is it's not going to sell more than 50,000 copies or something. They have a threshold, right? But if you write a book and 1,000 people read it and it's helpful to that 1,000 people, that's a gift.
Totally.
So if you need, now, for those of us who need to make money, like a career, then I understand you may not have money to do it. Right. But so that's the publishing industry part of it. Luckily what's happened, we've proved them wrong, right? And that's why the first book in the series was self-published, because nobody did want to publish it. Mm-hmm. Our book sells incredibly well. And there are more families that want this information.
Yeah. Well, that's the reason I started the podcast, was because the book wasn't happening. So I was like, wait, I don't need someone to greenlight a podcast. I'll just do this and start it. And a month later it was up and running. And here we are 186 episodes in, and it's been great. So
excellent. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess
because these stories need to be shared, right? And the perspective, there isn't another podcast that is called Infertile AF.
Right.
And that is a perspective. In that title, there's a perspective that relates to people, right? That people are as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, I love this.
Thank you.
This is going to be a conversation that I feel comfortable in.
Yes. Good. I'm so glad.
All the judgment that might happen and all the kind of walking on eggshells. I know it's okay, I don't need to do that.
Oh, that makes me so happy, because there have been people that are like, I don't want to do it based on the title, just a very small amount of people. But I have had people be like, I don't think my family would feel very comfortable. And I'm like, okay, cool. No worries. Okay,
absolutely. But you need to know there's lots of families that are the opposite.
Totally. So, let's talk a little bit more about the book specifically. You have this inclusivity piece, which I think is so great. This power piece. Let's just break it down a little bit. Tell me why the inclusivity piece was so important to you.
Well, it's what we're talking about in this very thing, right? Which is that more of us deserve to see our stories in a book, reflected in the book. So when we say inclusive, what I just mean is I want lots of us to see ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that's in the language that's used, in body shape and size, and in experience, right? So for example, nowhere in this book do we say growing up means learning to have sex, because some people don't want to have sex, and you don't need to have sex to have a perfectly lovely life, right? You don't need to have sex to have intimacy or relationships. So inclusivity for us is obviously it's stuff about body shape, size, color, but a lot of it is about experience. And again, so for example, it was really, really important that there's a page on miscarriages, because bizarrely, we all know how common they are, and yet they're not in kids' books.
Right.
And I think this idea was well, it's too much for kids. It's not. Mm-mm. Right. And the way that we do it is gentle, and you can read it or not read it, and you can go deep or not. Mm-hmm. Right. Another thing that's important for me is thinking, because as I'm an adult and a parent, and of course, this is a thing nobody tells you about, is parenting is just constantly being triggered, right? Constantly you're being triggered about past harm and violence and trauma, right? And trouble that you haven't worked through. And so you sit down with your kid to do some sex education, and then you realize that actually you never got the chance to properly mourn or grieve or work through your miscarriages. And then it's mentioned, and then you're sitting there. So we write with those parents in mind, mm-hmm. right? So it's a way that you can kind of move in and move out of it. But it's just, it's for us, again, inclusivity is just about, it's about inviting more of us to the conversation, mm-hmm. because then it's going to be better.
Can you tell me specifically, for people that are listening that haven't seen the book yet, but they will, how did you specifically cover the miscarriage piece of it? Can we talk a little bit more about that?
Right.
What did you feel like it was important to include and all that?
I feel like, well, what was important to number one is the word, right? So we want to give kids, that's the first thing. And really the base thing is the language, right? I want kids to know that there's a thing that happens called miscarriage, that when it's the thing we started the conversation with. When a sperm and an egg meet, they do not always turn into a baby. And I don't give the stats, but of course we know it's more than half the time they don't, right? So it's about half the time, more than half, I can't remember. But so I want them to, number one, know that it's that when people try to make a baby, it doesn't work every time. And there's a word for when it starts to grow and it stops growing. And that's called a miscarriage. Or I also offer that it's also called a spontaneous abortion because that term means
the medical,
the medical term, when something stops before it's done, right? So that's number one. I want them to know, and then we just add a lot of things. So it's a thing that happens, and when it happens, people have a lot of feelings, right? So and then we just have some people feel, sad. Some people feel like it's their fault. Some people feel tired. And sometimes it hurts, and sometimes it doesn't. All of these things, and then we make it very clear that that it's different for everybody. And so, because I also want that, because that's also true, right? And so then it just allows space. So you could, as a parent, you could read this with a child and not say anything, or you could read with a child and say that actually happened to me, right? And it doesn't. The other thing is, I guess another big point we make, of course, is when we say people sometimes think it's their fault, we say it's never their fault, right? That's not how it works. That's not how bodies work. So we also want to. This is doing a piece of countering shame, which is this idea that somehow you did something wrong.
Yes.
Right. Which is what we teach kids, right?
That's immediately what you think when you have a miscarriage, or what I thought, what did I do? Shoot. Oh my God. What did I do?
Because it's how you were raised. Not just in your family, but it's how all of it, it's how the culture says, if you eat too much sugar, you get cavities. If you eat this way, you're going to get fat or pimples, etc. It's always your fault. Right. That's actually not how bodies work. We know that's not how bodies work. This is a big problem I have with a lot of education, is that it's not scientifically accurate. Yes. So that was really important to kind of separate that piece. Yes. But just to have it in. So it's just one page. It's the book is 432 pages. It's one page, but it was so important.
And what about the other fertility stuff that you guys cover, for people that haven't read it?
Right. So what's important is, again, it's a comic. So you see illustrations of all of these things. But we wanted people to know. So we start by saying there's lots of ways to make babies. And then in this book, so in our earlier books, because they were for younger kids, you can't really get into it because kids will just stop running to read. But in this book, we cover IVF and IUI and surrogacy and adoption. And actually, we don't do adoption because that part is about making the baby. But and then we explain it all, right? So there is actually a little graphic of a syringe.
The graphics are so good. And I was like, oh, I'm even flipping through it oh, I didn't know that. And to be clear, if people haven't seen so we see all this stuff. We don't actually see it happening, right? So at no point you don't actually see a tube going into a vulva. But you don't have the sperm with the bow tie?
We don't have the sperm with the bow tie. But the descriptions are there. So you see all the medical parts. Yeah. But the nice thing about Fiona Smith's illustrations is they're very kind of inviting, right? Totally. So they're not clinical at all. They're very warm, and kids love them. So that's the other piece I would say is this is such a difficult conversation. And one of the ways we can make it easier is by not making it kind of gloomy, right? Or clinical or medical. Let's keep it in the same it's the same color palette as when we're talking about making friends and having crushes, because it's just part of life. It's all part of life. And that's the other message is life is complicated and messy. And I have to also just say, kids know that, right? A lot of children's books, the people who make them think we have to keep that from kids, right? We have to keep it nice and light. But of course, we know that the books that kids love the most are always the dark, but the books that are dramatic. And, yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. I dog-eared a couple pages. I just want to read a couple things that I love that you wrote. And one of them is page 34. It says, people treat sex like it's a mystery. And then I'm jumping ahead a little bit. It says, learning about sex is more than just learning where babies come from and how not to get a disease. And I was like, yes, because that's all we learn, right?
Right. Of course. It's still all many kids learn.
Yeah.
Things haven't changed that much, unfortunately.
Absolutely. There's one other thing that I want to read, that 172, you talk about menstruation. And again, these amazing graphics. It says, if a body has ovaries and a uterus, one of the biggest changes during puberty is that it can start to release eggs about once per month as part of the menstrual cycle. So you kind of talk through it. But again, it's it's got this playful, upbeat upbeat almost. Like it's not the scared, be scared of your body. Menstruation's bad. You're going to have hormones and be a bitch, like it's just like, that's what we were taught. It was like, when you have your period, you're crabby and, it's just, it's such a bummer. But I'm so glad again that it's changing, and thanks in part to books like this.
And the other thing we do that's very key is that we never say, like we say in the language can be a bit clunky when you want to be accurate, but we just say like, it's a time when you might be able to start making a baby, right? We never say, and again, unfortunately, this is where it slips in. Most sex ed says, once you start having your period, you can make a baby. And that's not true. And it's also sending this message to the 35-year-old that they did something wrong, right? So we want to make it from the beginning clear that like not everybody can make a baby.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that body can't, have a relationship and have love and have a family.
Right.
They just might not be able to make a baby.
Absolutely. Do you feel comfortable, Corey, talking about your family building journey at all?
Sure.
A little bit? Okay. Can you tell me like what you went through?
Sure. Well, yeah. So I have a partner and we have a kid. And so, so we did it the old fashioned way. And so, and it didn't, I mean, here's what I'll share about this is that, and I knew this already intellectually, but intercourse is like the worst way to make a baby, right? So it's just, it's not, because this is this other weird thing, which is like you're taught that if you have the kind of bodies and that's the kind of sex you have, that it's fun, right? If you're given that education, which is like, it's a pleasurable thing. And then, and is also something that you can make a baby. It is not, I think it's a ridiculous way to try to make a baby. It's not a fun way. I mean, I won't, because I don't have consent, so I won't go into the details of it, but I didn't enjoy it. I mean, I will absolutely say, like, I did not enjoy the baby making process.
Yeah.
It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't fun. It was awkward and frustrating.
Yes.
So it wasn't anything like all of those books, right? Because I think and in fairness, I mean, because the books are focusing, I mean, I'm very happy. I have a kid. It's the best, being a parent is my favorite identity.
Same. How old is your kid?
7.5 or 7.75. Yeah. But I didn't like the making of it.
Yeah.
And we were very clear, because we are a queer family, like that we're going to try this one way. And if it doesn't work, we're going to try another way. Right. And so that was sort of the gift of kind of queer community being queer, is that like, there was not the pressure that if this way doesn't work, then that's it. So we already knew, because I also, as I said, I had a lot of friends that have had more complicated fertility journeys.
Yeah.
And, some of whom included not getting to have kids, and sort of living through that and that loss and that grief. So for us, for me, I knew that it was going to be, I didn't expect that it was going to go easily. And I knew that it might involve some different people, right? That it wasn't this myth of just like, well, there's just two bodies and they make.
And then the stork shows up.
So it just shows up, and then it's just great. They just drop it and do that.
Right.
So that was that. So now, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Have you have you read The Miscarriage Page?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you imagine that you would read that with your kids? Like, have you thought about that?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I was actually talking to my son this morning about. He looked at something on my social media and it was Rainbow Baby Day, and he's technically a rainbow baby. And he was like, what does that mean? I'm a rainbow baby? What does that mean? So I was trying to explain to him. And then I was like, okay, I think he's even at the age where we can sit together and we can go through. And I said, I had 4 losses. I got pregnant 4 times, and they didn't turn out to be babies. And I mean, he was, not really grasping it, but it was a good entree into this, because I knew that we were going to have this conversation today. So yeah, I do.
So for you, and with your older child,
she's almost 13. It's been a thing
you talk about. So miscarriages, like you've talked to her about.
Yeah, I have, and she hears me recording this podcast for the past 3 years and talking about this incessantly and on these support groups and stuff. So she's very aware of all of this, and which is good, right? The thing is, that she's going to be prepared in a different way than you were. Yeah, I hope so. I mean, do you think, Corey, that we can kind of change the scope of sex education in the world, like? Obviously, this is okay.
I think we can. I think it's going to take a generation, but our kids are growing up in a very different way with way more options in terms of gender identity and sexual orientation. Right? So many kids, depending on where they grew up, a lot of teenagers already know that there's an orientation called asexual, and that in fact not wanting to have sex doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. So I think I do think so. And of course, we're also experiencing this, particularly in the States, this giant backlash where we have parents that want to shut these conversations down, that want to prevent kids from getting any of these books. So, it's not like it's going to be an easy path, but I do think, I think the thing that's going to change it is our kids, right? I mean, they're the ones that are kind of going to teach us. And because kids are also developing new language all the time for all of this stuff.
Right.
And they're just going to demand more. Like, that's the thing. Like, when I write for teenagers and then when I work with people who are in their teens and 20s, like, I'm blown away by how much they expect of adults around them, which I was not raised to expect anything.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's good. I mean, of course, it can be challenging sometimes because you're like, okay, that's enough. Don't expect so much.
Totally.
But they're the ones that are going to make it better.
Thank you guys so much. And thank you again to Cory Silverberg. I loved talking to you. Thank you for being on my show. Everybody check out Cory's books, including, Sex and many other books. Just Google Cory. You can follow Cory on Instagram at Cory Silverberg. And I also wanted to remind you guys to check out Fertility Rally. Definitely come to us if you need a safe place to land, if you need a safe space. It is just the place that I wish I had when I was in the midst of it. My co-founder Blair is in the midst of her IVF journey for baby number 2. So we are still in the thick of it. We have incredible support groups. We have incredible Facebook groups, private Facebook groups. We have incredible content and events, IRL and virtual. So we would love to have you as part of our family. Check us out on Instagram at Fertility Rally or go to our website, which is fertilityrally.com. Again, if you want to give this podcast a 5-star review and a rating, it really helps us get recognized. And by us, I mean me, because it's really just me and my engineer, Ryan. Thank you, Ryan, for all your hard work. So thank you guys again for listening. I will talk to you next time.